My mother spent 63 years teaching me one lesson. No matter what I did, I would never be enough. My name is Diane Walker. I'm 59 years old, divorced, and for most of my life, I believed the problem was me. That's what happens when you grow up as the unwanted child. You become an expert at apologizing for things that were never your fault. You work harder, love harder, sacrifice harder. Because deep down, you keep hoping that one day the people who wounded you will finally look at you and say, "You mattered too." But some parents never do. And some daughters spend their entire lives starving emotionally while sitting at a table full of family. I know because I was one of them. My younger sister Rebecca was my mother's entire world from the day she was born. Beautiful. Charming. Fragile. That was the word everyone used for Rebecca. Fragile. Meanwhile, I was independent, which is a polite way families describe children they emotionally neglect. Rebecca got comfort. I got responsibility. If Rebecca cried, Mom rushed to hold her. If I cried, Mom told me to stop being dramatic. When Rebecca forgot homework, Mom drove back to school to deliver it. When I forgot homework, Mom said, "Maybe you'll learn to be responsible." Different rules. Different standards. Different love. Children notice these things long before adults admit them. And once you notice, you can never fully stop noticing again. My father saw it too. But he rarely interfered. He was the quiet type. Worked construction his entire life. Exhausted by dinner. Emotionally absent in ways people used to excuse because that's how men were back then. Still, sometimes he'd slip me extra money quietly and say, "Don't mind your mother." But I did mind. How could I not? I was 12 years old the first time I realized my mother genuinely preferred my sister. Rebecca had forgotten her ballet shoes before a recital. Mom drove 30 minutes home to retrieve them. That same week, I had a school debate competition. I remember standing outside the auditorium scanning the crowd for her face. She never came. When I got home with my participation certificate, she barely looked up from the television. But later that night, I heard her on the phone telling Aunt Linda all about Rebecca's ballet performance. Not one word about me. That was the moment something inside me quietly broke. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just silently. Like a light turning off in a room nobody realized existed. By the time we became adults, the pattern had become permanent. Rebecca drifted through life cushioned by my mother's endless support. She married young, divorced twice, changed careers constantly, and somehow remained the center of every family conversation. Every crisis Rebecca experienced became a family emergency. Meanwhile, I became the dependable one. The reliable one. The one nobody worried about because I handled everything alone. I put myself through nursing school while working nights at a grocery store. No financial help. No emotional encouragement. Just survival. When I graduated, my mother told relatives Rebecca would have done well in university too if life hadn't been so stressful for her. I remember standing there holding my degree while listening to my achievement become another story about my sister. Even then, I still kept trying. That's the tragic thing about children desperate for parental love. Hope survives humiliation far longer than it should. When my marriage fell apart at 43, my mother barely reacted. My husband cheated on me with a coworker after 20 years together. 20 years. Gone. I was devastated. But Mom's response was, "Well, men need attention, Diane." Attention. As though betrayal was somehow my failure. 3 months later, Rebecca broke up with a boyfriend she dated for 11 weeks. My mother organized a family dinner because Rebecca was emotionally fragile. I wish I were exaggerating. I'm not. There comes a point when unfairness becomes almost surreal. Like watching a play where everyone memorized the same script except you. Still, I continued helping. Because despite everything, she was my mother. And because some part of me kept hoping love could eventually be earned through loyalty. Then my father got sick. Pancreatic cancer. Aggressive. Cruel. Fast. Within 6 months, the strongest man I knew became frighteningly thin. Rebecca visited occasionally but always had reasons to leave early. The hospital smell upset her. The stress overwhelmed her. The conversations were too depressing. Meanwhile, I became my father's primary caregiver while still working full-time. I drove him to chemotherapy. Sat beside hospital beds. Managed medications. Cleaned up vomit. Held his hand during nights when pain made him tremble. My mother barely coped emotionally, so I carried her too. And for a while, I thought maybe this tragedy would finally bring us together. Sometimes hardship softens families. But not ours. Because even while my father was dying, my mother still centered Rebecca. One evening at the hospital, Dad was sleeping when Mom suddenly said, "You know, Rebecca's struggling financially again." I stared at her in disbelief. My father was literally dying 10 feet away. And she wanted to discuss Rebecca's bills. That was my family in one sentence. Even death could not compete with my sister's needs. My father passed away 2 weeks later. And despite everything complicated between us, losing him shattered me. Because he had been the only person in that house who occasionally saw me clearly. At the funeral, relatives praised me constantly. "You were amazing with your father. He was lucky to have you. You sacrificed so much." My mother stood beside me hearing all of it. Do you know what she said afterward? "Well, Rebecca would have helped more if she were emotionally stronger." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because sometimes pain becomes so predictable it loses the ability to shock you. After Dad died, things got worse. Much worse. My mother became completely emotionally dependent on Rebecca while practically depending on me for everything practical. Rebecca handled feelings. I handled reality. Bills. Appointments. Repairs. Insurance. Groceries. Medication. Every responsibility somehow landed on my shoulders. And every emotional reward somehow went to Rebecca. One Christmas, I spent nearly 8 hours cooking dinner for 14 people while Rebecca arrived late carrying store-bought cookies. Mom hugged her dramatically and announced, "Rebecca always brings warmth into the room." I remember standing there covered in sweat from the kitchen thinking, what exactly do I bring then? Electricity? Structural support? Invisible labor? People talk about emotional neglect like it's obvious. Usually it isn't. Usually it's small moments repeated for decades until you slowly disappear inside your own family. Then came the phone call that changed everything. I was 56. Working a night shift. My mother had fallen down the stairs. Broken hip. Minor head injury. Rebecca called me hysterically crying, "I can't handle this." So naturally, I handled it. Hospital paperwork. Doctors. Rehabilitation arrangements. Insurance disputes. Every exhausting detail. Rebecca visited Mom during recovery carrying flowers and crying dramatically beside the bed. My mother looked at her with such tenderness you'd think Rebecca had personally carried her through the fire. Meanwhile, I was sleeping 4 hours a night trying to manage everything. One afternoon, I overheard my mother speaking to a nurse. She said, "Rebecca's been my rock through all this." My rock. I stood outside the hospital door holding folders full of medical paperwork I'd spent hours organizing. And something inside me finally snapped. Not loudly. Quietly. Completely. Because for the first time, I realized something devastating. Nothing I did would ever change my role in her story. I could sacrifice my entire life and still remain emotionally invisible. That understanding changes a person. After Mom returned home, Rebecca disappeared almost entirely. The stress became too much. She needed space. Meanwhile, Mom expected me to continue managing everything. And for a few months, I did. Out of habit. Out of guilt. Out of conditioning built over 50 years. Then one evening, I arrived exhausted after work to find Rebecca sitting comfortably drinking tea while my mother criticized me for being late. Late. After stopping at the pharmacy for her medications. Rebecca smiled sympathetically while Mum complained, "Diane's always so tense lately." That was it. That was the moment. Not a huge betrayal. Not screaming. Not drama. Just one final tiny humiliation placed on top of thousands before it. I looked around that room and suddenly saw my entire life clearly. I saw a woman who spent decades begging emotionally for scraps. I saw a sister perfectly comfortable letting me drown as long as she remained adored. And I saw myself disappearing year after year trying to earn love that was never freely available to me. So I did something my family never expected. I stopped. I stopped volunteering. Stopped rescuing. Stopped anticipating everyone's needs before my own. And people who benefit from your self-sacrifice rarely react kindly when you begin protecting yourself. Rebecca called me selfish. My mother cried dramatically to relatives. Apparently I had changed. And she was right. I had. For the first time in my life, I began acting like I mattered too. That terrified them. Because dysfunctional families depend on assigned roles. The caretaker. The victim. The golden child. The disappointment. Once one person stops performing, the entire system shakes. Suddenly Rebecca had to help more. Suddenly Mum experienced the consequences of depending emotionally on one child while exploiting another. And suddenly I had space to think clearly for the first time in decades. Do you know what clarity feels like after emotional manipulation? Lonely. At first, it feels incredibly lonely. Because you realize how much of your identity was built around being useful to people who never truly valued you. But eventually, loneliness becomes peace. And peace becomes freedom. One Sunday afternoon, my mother called crying because Rebecca had forgotten to pick up her prescription. Forgotten. The same mistake I would have been crucified for. I drove over reluctantly. When I arrived, Mum immediately started defending Rebecca. She's under so much pressure. I looked around that tiny living room and suddenly asked a question I'd swallowed my entire life. What pressure exactly? The silence afterward felt nuclear. Because nobody in my family had ever challenged the mythology surrounding Rebecca. Not openly. My mother stared at me like I'd slapped her. And for once, I didn't apologize. That conversation changed everything. Rebecca accused me later of being resentful and bitter. And honestly, maybe I was resentful. People become resentful when they spend decades emotionally starving while watching someone else receive endless nourishment. That's human nature. But bitterness? No. By then I was becoming something far more dangerous to dysfunctional people. I was becoming honest. A few weeks after that argument, my mother stopped speaking to me entirely. Not completely. Just strategically. The silent treatment had always been her favorite weapon. When I was a child, she'd withhold affection. As an adult, she withheld emotional access. It was punishment disguised as hurt feelings. Rebecca, of course, became the messenger. She's devastated by how cold you've become. Cold. That word almost made me laugh. Because people will drain your warmth for decades and then act shocked when you finally become tired. Still, despite everything, I continued helping occasionally. Not because I wanted approval anymore. But because I couldn't fully turn off 50 years of conditioning overnight. That's something people who grow up in healthy families don't understand. You don't just walk away emotionally. Even when you recognize the manipulation, part of you still hopes things might change. Then came Easter. The final fracture. Rebecca hosted dinner that year. Which surprised everyone because Rebecca rarely hosted anything unless it benefited her somehow. I arrived carrying food I'd spent all morning preparing. Rebecca barely acknowledged me. My mother greeted her like royalty. The entire evening became another performance centered around my sister's greatness. Rebecca's decorating. Rebecca's cooking. Rebecca's stressful life. At one point, Mum actually told guests I don't know what I'd do without Rebecca. I sat there listening quietly while relatives nodded. Nobody mentioned who handled Mum's hospital paperwork, who drove her to appointments, who paid for her medication during insurance delays, who answered midnight emergency calls. Invisible labor rarely gets applause, especially in dysfunctional families. Then dessert happened. And with it, the moment that changed my life permanently. My cousin Elaine asked casually, "So Diane, are you still helping your mom every week?" Before I could answer, Rebecca laughed and said, "Oh, Diane likes being the martyr." Martyr. The exact same word my brother had used in the inheritance story you wrote before? Wait, no, different family. Funny how toxic people always recycle the same language. The table laughed lightly. Even my mother smiled. Something inside me went completely still. Not angry. Not emotional. Just finished. Because suddenly I realized these people had built an entire family identity around minimizing me. If I sacrificed, I was dramatic. If I spoke up, I was difficult. If I withdrew, I was selfish. There was no version of me they planned to treat fairly. So for the first time in my life, I stopped protecting them. I looked directly at Rebecca and said calmly, "You call me a martyr because it's easier than admitting you abandoned Mom whenever things became inconvenient." The entire room froze. Rebecca's smile vanished instantly. My mother gasped like I'd committed murder. But I kept going. Years of swallowed truth started pouring out before I could stop it. I handled Dad's cancer care while you disappeared. I managed Mom's rehabilitation while you cried for attention. You get praised for showing up emotionally while other people do all the actual work. Silence. Heavy silence. Rebecca's face turned bright red. Then she did what she always did when confronted. She cried. Immediately. Tears streamed down her face while my mother rushed to comfort her. Not me. Never me. Even in that moment. Even after everything. My mother wrapped her arms around Rebecca and glared at me like I was the cruel one. And strangely, that was the exact moment I became free. Because seeing the pattern repeat so clearly finally killed the last tiny piece of hope inside me. I no longer wanted her approval. That changed everything. I left dinner early that night. And for the first time in years, I didn't cry during the drive home. I felt calm. Completely calm. Like someone had finally removed a heavy coat I'd been forced to wear my entire life. After that, I stepped back almost entirely. No more weekly grocery trips. No more endless emotional labor. No more rushing to solve every crisis. Rebecca panicked almost immediately. Because suddenly she had to deal with responsibilities she'd avoided for decades. My mother called constantly at first. Then guilt messages started appearing. "I suppose I'll manage somehow. You know stress affects Rebecca badly. Family should stick together." But notice something important. None of those messages included accountability. Not once did she say, "I hurt you." Not once did she acknowledge the imbalance. Because some parents would rather lose a child than admit wrongdoing. Months passed. And for the first time in my life, I started building an identity outside my family role. I joined a book club. Started gardening. Took weekend trips alone. I even began therapy, which terrified me initially because people from my generation were taught therapy meant weakness. Instead, therapy felt like finally learning a language everyone else somehow already knew. My therapist asked me one question that haunted me for weeks. What would your life have looked like if you'd been loved properly? I cried for almost an hour after that session. Not because I hated my mother. but because I suddenly understood how much of my life had been shaped by emotional deprivation. Do you know what unloved daughters become experts at? Over-functioning. People-pleasing. Self-erasure. We become women who believe our worth depends entirely on usefulness. That realization changed how I saw everything. Then my mother got sick again. This time it was serious. Congestive heart failure. Suddenly Rebecca started calling me constantly. Not because she missed me. Because she was overwhelmed. Funny how quickly people rediscover your value when responsibilities appear. Rebecca cried on the phone, "I can't do this alone." I remember sitting quietly listening to the same sister who'd mocked me for years finally confronting reality. And for a moment, I almost gave in. Old instincts rushed back immediately. Fix it. Rescue them. Carry everyone again. But therapy had taught me something painful. Love without boundaries becomes self-destruction. So instead of rushing back into my old role, I simply said, "You'll need to speak with Mom's doctors and organize home care." Rebecca sounded stunned. "But you're better at these things." There it was. The truth. Not "you care more." Not "Mom needs you emotionally." No. "You're better at handling difficult things." That had always been my role. Not beloved daughter. Not cherished child. Human survival tool. I helped minimally after that. Practical information. Occasional visits. Nothing more. And honestly, the guilt nearly destroyed me at first. Because toxic family systems train you to feel selfish anytime you prioritize your own well-being. Meanwhile, Rebecca unraveled quickly. Without me absorbing responsibility, the pressure landed on her fully for the first time in her life. And she hated it. One evening she exploded at me over the phone. "You're punishing Mom because you're jealous." Jealous. That word sat in my chest for days. Was I jealous? Maybe once. Maybe years ago. But by then, it wasn't jealousy anymore. It was grief. Grief for the childhood I didn't have. Grief for the mother I kept trying to earn. Grief for the daughter version of myself that spent decades believing love had to be deserved through suffering. Those are different things. A few weeks later, I visited Mom at home. She looked smaller than I remembered. Older. Fragile in ways that frightened me despite everything between us. For a moment, seeing her sitting alone in that chair nearly shattered all my boundaries instantly. Because no matter how much pain parents cause, part of you still remembers being their child. We talked awkwardly for a while. Then suddenly she said, "You've changed." I looked at her carefully and replied, "No. I finally stopped pretending." She stared at me silently. And then something happened I never expected in my lifetime. My mother cried. Not dramatic tears like Rebecca. Quiet tears. Old tears. She looked down at her hands and whispered, "I didn't realize how much I relied on you." Not an apology. But the closest thing I had ever received. I wish I could tell you everything healed beautifully after that. It didn't. Real life rarely gives perfect emotional endings. My mother never fully admitted the favoritism. Rebecca never transformed into a self-aware person overnight. Some wounds remain partially open forever. But something important did change. For the first time, my mother started seeing consequences. Rebecca wasn't capable of carrying responsibilities long-term. And without me silently compensating for everyone, reality became unavoidable. Over the next year, our family dynamic shifted painfully. Not perfectly. But honestly. Rebecca grew resentful because she no longer occupied the effortless golden child position. My mother became quieter. Less performative. Sometimes I caught her looking at me strangely, almost like she was trying to understand who I actually was beyond the role she assigned me decades earlier. And me? I stopped shrinking. That was the biggest change of all. I stopped apologizing for existing. Stopped over-explaining boundaries. Stopped sacrificing my health for people who confused access with entitlement. One afternoon, near the end of her life, my mother said something that still stays with me. We were sitting on her porch watching rain fall across the yard. Very softly, she said, "You were always stronger than Rebecca." I waited. Then finally, "I think I leaned on you too hard because I knew you'd survive it." That sentence broke my heart more than all the cruelty ever had. Because suddenly, I understood something devastating. Some parents don't intentionally choose one child because they love them more. Sometimes they choose based on who requires less from them emotionally. Strong children become emotionally abandoned precisely because adults assume they'll survive it. And we do survive it. But survival leaves scars too. My mother passed away 8 months later. At the funeral, relatives praised Rebecca's emotional devotion again. And for the first time in my life, I didn't care. Because I finally understood something freeing. People can misunderstand your role in the family story forever. That doesn't change the truth. I knew who carried the weight. And deep down, so did my mother. This has been Toxic Family Files. And remember, the strongest children in a family are often the ones who receive the least protection.